there, and welcome back for another lesson in APUS history. I'm your APUSH Lady Boss, and I'm glad you're joining me. Today we're going to be talking about topic 3.12, Movement in the Early Republic. Go ahead and click down in the description if you would like to have some follow-along notes or some guided notes to follow along as we go through this lesson. So we have two objectives here that we're trying to understand. First, we want to explain how and why migration and immigration to and within North America caused competition and conflict over time. And then second, explain the continuities and changes in regional attitudes about slavery as it expanded from 1754 to 1800. So there are three main ideas involved in this lesson. The first is related to the relationship between American Indians. We see alliances shifting, we see trade and sovereignty as being really important concepts in this period. The second main part is going to be frontier cultures. And then our third main part is going to be the regional attitudes about slavery that develop and become more intense throughout this era. So we'll start off by talking about American Indians, move on to frontier culture, and lastly, talk about changing attitudes in slavery. So just as a little historical context, this lesson is really talking about all of period 3. So we're talking 1754 to 1800. So these three maps kind of show you the time that we're discussing. So in 1754, we still have the British North American colonies as well as the French colonies. In 1763, you see that France has been defeated in the 7 Years' War, and so we just have the British American colonies. But then, of course, by 1800, we have the United States of America, which has grown beyond the 13 states to include a few more areas. So additionally, just for some helpful kind of background information, the population estimates during this time, really the nation is sitting at about 1 million people in 1750. And by 1800, that number has grown to above 5 million people. And we see significant immigration happening. We see still forced immigration of African Americans to be enslaved in the United States. And these numbers do not include the American Indians that are living in the region at this time. So let's start by discussing further the relationship with American Indians. Well, really, we see a major change happening as a result of the 7 Years' War. So Native Americans who had before they had been allied with the French, now had to shift their alliances. They had to deal with now the British instead of the French for trade and for negotiations regarding land. And so in a lecture by Professor Ned Blackhawk, he is discussing how the indigenous peoples in the area known as the Ohio River Valley and the Northwest Territory, how they responded to these changes. And he said, these indigenous populations are by no means ready to submit to the British monarchy. Quite the contrary. They believe that while the French have been defeated, none of their communities have been conquered. They believe that the French allies have surrendered unjustly because they themselves are not party to the surrender, nor included in the terms of the Treaty of Peace. And they believe fundamentally that these lands in the interior are theirs, and they tell the British so very openly and dramatically. And so really, what Professor Blackhawk is discussing here is that just because the French surrendered in the French and Indian War did not mean that the native peoples living in the area also surrendered their land. And so what we see happening after the 7 Years' War is some significant conflict in the area as American colonists began to encroach on their lands further. The largest one is going to be Pontiac's rebellion. And as you can see, there were quite a few various American Indian tribes that allied together to rebel against these encroachments. Another form of alliances that were happening were after the Revolutionary War. So when the British were defeated and the American colonies became the United States of America, the British and the Spanish ally with American Indians on the frontier, supply them with weapons, engage in trade with them, and they try to provoke them to attack frontier settlements as the Americans moved to the West. Another example of an alliance that grew during this time was called the Western Confederacy. And as you can see, once again, it's a large group with many different American Indian tribes in it. And probably the biggest thing that was talked about in period 3 with this Western Confederacy was the Battle of Fawn Timbers. And while this battle was successful for the United States, leading to the Treaty of Greenville and the removal of American Indians from this area in Ohio, it comes at the end of many victories from the Western Confederacy. So they did launch successful attacks against the United States and prevent encroachments for a good amount of time after the Revolutionary War. Continuing on with the relationship with American Indians, we have a few other examples of events during this time. So during the Revolutionary War, Washington ordered one of his generals, Sullivan, to invade the Iroquois lands, and he took a scorched earth approach. These American Indians had allied with the British during the Revolutionary War, and so Washington ordered them to be, basically annihilated to prevent them from supporting the British. In the years following the Revolutionary War, there's a series of treaties and laws that characterize the future relationship with various American Indian tribes. So the Treaty of Hopeville was an important negotiation that established peaceful relations and boundaries between the Chickasaw and the U.S. However, other Native American tribes did not recognize this treaty because they were not part of it. And so it ends up setting a negative precedent where it allows for the U.S. government to make changes, ignore the treaty, and so it leads to some contentious issues in the future. In 1788, a very significant thing happened with American Indians, and this was the inclusion of the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. So the Commerce Clause stated that American Indian tribes who signed treaties with the United States were sovereign, independent nations. And so this was a really important moment for recognizing the sovereignty and autonomy of American Indian tribes. Another example during these years is the Indian Trade and Intercourse Act, and this is the first law to regulate interactions with American Indians, and it mandated that the federal government handle those interactions rather than state governments. Okay, so moving on to frontier culture. Now, this is an interesting aspect of American history that is often overlooked. So by 1800, so the end of this period, about 20% of the American population is living on the frontier. So in the map there, it's the lighter green color. It's the area between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. There's some significant challenges in the area. For example, the federal government really needs the money from the sale of these lands to pay off war debts. And so they desire for Americans to move to the West. However, conflict with American Indians in the area was significant, as we've already talked about. And without a strong army or the ability to pay for defense, there's a struggle to protect frontier peoples as they move out there. And just the regulation of this mass migration was beyond the abilities of the young government. So something that's interesting in one of these areas in particular that became called the State of Franklin. There were 4 counties that are now currently 8 counties in Tennessee. They declared themselves to be independent after the Revolutionary War. So they did not want to automatically become part of the United States. They believed that they were distinct people, that they were very dissimilar to the Northeastern elite, and that Washington and other founding fathers had not considered their particular needs in the writing of the foundational documents. Okay, additionally, we have some more examples of frontier culture. So first we have the Paxton Boys. The Paxton Boys were a group of frontiersmen in Pennsylvania who had very different attitudes about American Indians than more of the Eastern Pennsylvanians. And so they formed a vigilante group and attacked American Indians. This is a very racial white supremacist group that slaughtered innocent American Indians, really dealing with the conflicts between culture and land here. All right, another example of frontier culture is going to be looking at the life of Daniel Boone. So Daniel Boone ends up becoming like a folk hero. So he explores Kentucky. He's known for blazing a trail through the Cumberland Gap, which really allowed for more migration to the West happen. And so there's lots of stories about his influence in the frontier culture. Another person that you may have heard of is John Chapman, also known as Johnny Appleseed. He was a very eccentric person. He planted apple orchards throughout Pennsylvania, all the way through Illinois. And he was known for sleeping outside and having an interesting relationship with animals, sleeping with them. There's all these legendary stories about him that kind of made him as well into a folk hero. But besides these three groups, the primary group that is living in the frontier during this time, they're called squatters and crackers. And yes, these are derogatory terms for this group of people. And it refers to landless migrants who lived off the grid. Their children did not attend school or join church. They often were very poor. They did not own enough. They didn't have enough money to own the land. And so they would squat, they would clear it, they would build their own homes. And as land speculators would come in, they sometimes would be kicked off their land. They would fight to protect it. But most importantly, at this time, they did not have the right to vote and therefore felt very much outside of the United States. They didn't have a role in setting the government. And so why should they care about the rules? So there's a real dichotomy of perception that begins during this time, and it continues and probably reaches its height during the presidency of Andrew Jackson in the late 1820s and early 1830s. And so the more favorable perception of these squatters would be that they were backwoodsmen, they were philosophers, they were strong and independent, and just your really traditional focused on, good quality values and character. So that would be one perspective of people that lived in the West. But a more negative and probably more common perspective was that they were white savages, ruthless brawlers and eye gorgers. They lived in dingy cabins with haggard wives and a brood of brats, referring to the many children that frontiers people often had. So here's a quote from Nancy Eisenberg, who wrote White Trash, the 400-Year Untold History of Class in America. She writes, "The ubiquity of squatters across the United States turned them into a powerful political trope. They came to be associated with 5 traits: crude habitations, boastful vocabulary, distrust of civilization and city folk, an instinctive love of liberty, read licentiousness, and 5 degenerate patterns of breeding. Yet even with such unappealing traits, the squatter also acquired some favorable qualities. The simple backwoodsman welcomed strangers into his cabin. The outrageous storyteller entertained them through the night. Squatters then were more than troublesome, uncouth rascals taking up lands they didn't own. This double identity made the squatter a contested figure. By the 1830s and 1840s, he was fully a symbol of partisan politics, celebrated as the iconic common man who came to epitomize Jacksonian democracy." So keep these ideas of frontier people in your mind as we continue through APUS history, especially going into Unit 4. So our final concept today is to discuss regional attitudes about slavery, and this concept has been addressed in previous lessons as well. But what we see happening is that after the Revolutionary War, we have westward expansion. So we have westward expansion into the Northwest Territory, and under the Articles of Confederation, that area was not allowed to have slavery at all. But we also see expansion into the Southern Territories, where we do see the expansion of slavery. So note the dates on those maps, because the lower map does go all the way to 1860. So it's really a preview of what's going to be happening in the next years. So in 1790, we see the first anti-slavery petition come before Congress. This was signed by Benjamin Franklin and the Pennsylvania Society for the Abolition of Slavery. They write, We earnestly entreat your serious attention to the subject of slavery, that you will be pleased to countenance the restoration of liberty to those unhappy men who alone in this land of freedom are degraded into perpetual bondage, and who amidst the general joy of surrounding freemen are groaning in servile subjection, that you will devise means for removing this inconsistency from the character of the American people, that you will promote mercy and justice towards this distressed race, and that you will step to the very verge of the powers vested in you for discouraging every species of traffic in the persons of our fellow man. So while areas like Pennsylvania are petitioning Congress, the federal government, to do something about slavery, we do see states beginning to emancipate the enslaved persons in their state. So as you can see on that graph, our states in New England have much higher populations of free Blacks than, of course, our southern and future Western states. Another thing that impacts the growth of slavery is going to be the cotton gin. We're going to see this become really significant in Unit 4. The cotton gin is going to speed up the cleaning of cotton, which allows for the process or the cultivation of cotton to become significantly more profitable. Another major thing that affects slavery at this time is that in the writing of the Constitution, Congress did not make any laws regarding the abolition of slavery, and instead they allowed for the importation of slaves to continue until 1807. And so in 1808, Congress did abolish the transatlantic slave trade. However, as you can see, between 1887 and 1808, 200,000 Africans were forcibly taken and enslaved. And in the almost 180 years prior to that, 400 Africans were forcibly taken and enslaved. So in that period of 21 years, the increase or the importation of Africans into America grew at a rapid pace. So hopefully this information was really helpful for you in understanding ideas about immigration and migration, frontier culture, and attitudes about slavery. Thank you for joining me. I hope this was really helpful. And if so, please like and subscribe.